So to start off with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. My name's Katie Wood. I'm the Access and Outreach Archivist at the University of Melbourne Archives here, and I'm going to be facilitating this session, People, Place and Space. There are 3 papers that are being presented today, so we have about half an hour for each paper, and I'll introduce each of the speakers at the start of that half an hour. So the speakers will speak, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion after each paper. The first paper that we have today is Jessie Lymn, who is a lecturer in the School of Information Studies at Charles Sturt University, and she's going to be speaking on collecting LGBTIQ history in a regional context.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. So, I have to read off this, and I've never done it before, so I apologise in advance if I look down too much. So thank you, everyone. And I want to start today with a quick reflection on current times. As I've been thinking through this research project and writing this paper, Australia is in the midst of a national historical moment of sorts around the issue of marriage equality. Of particular note in the current debate and activities is the desire that I see for non-same-sex attracted members of the community to out themselves as yes voters. That is, they'll vote yes for marriage equality. There's a definite sense, in my networks at least, of an advocacy for LGBT or queer rights, coming not just from us queers, but from a wider population. Reflecting on these everyday performances of advocacy as I reflect on my current research project, which is into regional queer memories, I can start to see strong connections between the two, especially around the concept of advocacy and ambassadorship. And in this paper today, I want to draw out conclusions from my research and consider or put forward some implications for archives and the wider collection sector. So, hopefully that's a really boring but simple map. I moved to Wagga Wagga, which is that little red dot there, in early 2016 with my partner and child. We made the move from the bright lights big city of Sydney with its rainbow flags and Mardi Gras parade to a regional town known mostly for its big institutional presence. Alongside my employer, the university, the town has a large air force and an army base. I wondered what the region would bring in terms of a queer community, and over the last year or so, this pretty middle-of-the-road regional farming hub city has done a good job at welcoming us and given me personally a lot more perspective on the importance of listening to and learning from regional voices when we think through a queer lens about collection challenges. So, I've been doing some research recently into an exhibition that the local museum in Wagga curated last year. The exhibition was titled We're Here, Riverina LGBT Stories. So, I'll just go back. Wagga there is in a region called the Riverina, which goes from about midway between Canberra and Wagga, kind of to the halfway mark on that screen, and down to Albury. It's a farming region and a very fertile agriculture space, I suppose. It's also a very safe national seat. So the exhibition was titled We're Here, Riverina LGBT Stories, and it was open for 8 weeks at the Museum of the Riverina in late 2016. The exhibition reflected a year-long process of community consultation and participation, and also featured a full day of public programming and film screenings. The museum occupies 2 sites in the city of Wagga Wagga, and it's run by the local city council. The exhibition was promoted and supported as a council activity, with rainbow flags flying outside the council chambers for the duration of the exhibition, which was the first time they'd been flown in the city. And just as an aside, the city council voted last night not to fly them again during this survey period. Only 5-4, so it was a close vote. The curatorial process for the exhibition, and I'm just going to show a couple of pictures from it, but they're to give you an idea of how it fit in the museum space. The curatorial process was both consultative and traditional, and it drew on contemporary practices and historical material. Andrew Flynn suggests that the historical traces of LGBT community members are often only found when they are, quote, objects of official interest and concern. And I think we talked about, I saw that in the previous panel as well. And one of the first findings that was made in researching the history of queers in the region was to discover a sodomy charge that was laid against a family member of one of the town's founders in the early 20th century. Other stories that were unearthed from the archive include the now famous local newspaper editorial written in the early 90s by the current Nationals MP, who was the then editor of the local newspaper, expressing his personal homophobic views on homosexuals and HIV, and the oral history of a local resident who was a 78er. So he marched in the first Mardi Gras protest in Sydney in 1978. And alongside this historical material, contemporary narratives of queer lives in the region were presented through everyday objects, archival material from their homes, and artworks. So there were quite a few artworks in the exhibition. The exhibition won the Local Government New South Wales Les Kelly Arts and Culture Award this year for a community with a population of between 30 and 100,000 people, and it's been nominated for another award that will be announced shortly. Most of the material donated and acquired through the exhibition has been added to the museum's collection as part of the newly established Riverina Rainbow collection. However, there are a couple of boxes of paperwork from the Riverina Gay and Lesbian Support Group, which was active in the early to mid-90s, that were passed on to the CSU Regional Archives. So I don't know if anyone knows about the Regional Archive model in New South Wales. The State Records has outpostings where there are repositories in each region, and they manage the records of the region. CSU has that in the Riverina. So that box of paperwork was deemed not to fit the collection policy of the museum, and the archives were happy to take it as part of their regional records collection, which is the non-state records and archives collection. The decision was also made to ensure that the papers stayed in the region, in the Riverina, rather than, for example, being passed on to the Australian Lesbian Gay Archives here in Melbourne. This regional priority is core to how I'm thinking through this research and helping me identify the intimacies that exist between different actors across the memory-making sectors in the region. So I knew that these boxes had been passed on to archives. I'd heard the rumour, and had suggested that processing the boxes might be a good project for one of our local master's students who was looking for a placement activity, and I suggested the archives. So whilst processing the box, Kate, our student, came across a sealed manila envelope. I hope that you can see this. It's labelled in a very harsh pencil handwriting, and it says, highly confidential, needs to be put under 30-year embargo with a little arrow going down at least. And it's this envelope that I want to focus on for the rest of my paper today. So I'm just going to remind you that this is all that's written on the envelope, and the envelope is sealed, and that there was no indication of what was in it. So there are a series of investigations that were done by our student on placement, the archive staff, which included talking with the archives manager about it. They made contact with the donor, and then a couple of museum staff were consulted, and finally the curator of the exhibition told the story of the envelope. So it was finally established that the envelope was full of, at times, quite intimate and explicit letters that were written to the support group, which the donor had kept, and that the exhibition curator had put into the envelope. So the curator had put them in there, she had sealed it, and she had put this note on it. So I want to take a moment now to think about the concept of advocacy and ambassadorship in collecting and preserving LGBTIQ histories, and whose role it is to advocate for these records. So in an interview with a prominent member of the Wagga community, who notes himself as, amongst many of his roles, the first openly gay counsellor, and he often emphasises the openly, he commented that he has in his various roles been an advocate for LGBT issues and an ambassador for them as well. He differentiated between the two roles by saying, and these are his words here, an advocate is more assertive, if you like, more active, more doing, whereas being an ambassador is a more softly approach and persuasive. So I want to use this advocate and ambassador titles here to think through the challenges of collecting, preserving, and at times reappraising or redescribing the records of LGBT people and histories. And I've chosen to focus in on this in a regional setting because of the way that intimacy works in a smaller ecosystem like Wagga. This intersection between advocacy and intimacy draws on and perhaps challenges queer notions of temporality, space and place. The early 21st century has seen an emerging body of knowledge looking at queer and LGBT memories as preserved in institutional and non-institutional collections. So Anne Svetkovich's and Jack Halberson's work, for example, or more recently Alania Cumbia's book Ephemeral Material, Queering the Archive, that are doing some of the things that I think Vern has challenged us to do in his keynote this morning. Preserving LGBT memories and histories should be an important part of work that's being done by collecting institutions at both state and national levels. But as Flynn again notes, these state institutions overwhelmingly privilege the voices of those with power and influence in society, and that when these others do appear in the archives, they rarely speak with their own voice, but rather they appear as objects of official interest and concern. Again. So the sodomy case that I mentioned earlier is a good example of that. And there have been attempts to address this absence, and here in Victoria in 2005, the Museum, State Library and ALGA, the Gay and Lesbian and Gay Archives, undertook a lesbian and bisexual, gay and transgender materials survey, which surveyed collections around Victoria for their LGBT content and proposed methods, a method or a series of methods for reclassification, which I think is a really interesting next step to be taking. And I like to think about collections not just in a strict A in the glam of archives, but to look across the broader collecting sector, because, and I'm going to talk a bit about museums and why I think these museum exhibitions are important, because they're drawing on the archival resources, so we need to work together. The convergence is happening. Andrew Gorman-Murray identified a lack of regional LGBT exhibitions in Australia when he did an analysis of 27 LGBT identified exhibitions from 1982 to 2005, and he found only one exhibition that was curated regionally. The other 26 exhibitions were travelling exhibitions or had been not really tailored to the region. The one example was at the Newcastle Regional Museum. The minor representation of regional stories in LGBT histories on public display creates a gap in both practice and literature. And I do want to acknowledge that there's more recent work that is being done in the last few years to shift this. So the Riverina region, the Hunter and Northern Rivers region have been exhibiting work, and I think Dalesford here in Victoria, is that right? And I'd love to hear of more examples if you have them. So a further challenge for these collecting institutions, and this is, I think, key to some of the struggle, is recognising the diversity of the LGBT lived experience. Queers aren't a homogenous community, and this is a challenge that sites like the Schulz Museum in Berlin are grappling with at the moment. These non-homogenous lived experiences form part of a wider everyday life record. The complexities of lived experience are further enhanced in a regional space as regional intimacies and knowledges complicate queer practices, and I argue archival description practices too. Which brings me back to this manila envelope, sealed for 30 years, from when we now know, but we didn't at the time. I want to consider the movement of the letters through time and space and suggest possible advocates or ambassadors for them through their relationship to the region and the memory-making spaces. And I'm just at the beginning of exploring these ideas in this project. At the moment, I'm not including the authors of the letters themselves in this analysis, although they are being considered as actors by the archives and as part of the description process. And I kind of wish I was in the other room listening to the Greer Archives talk at the same time, because hopefully they're addressing that too. So the actors that I've identified for this envelope of letters are the curator, the donor and the archivist. Each of them plays at some point an advocate or ambassadorial role, and it's important to understand and acknowledge this as we work towards a wider understanding of advocating for LGBT material in collections. These case studies that I'm going to present briefly aren't designed to draw generalisations from, rather to raise ideas and ask questions of what we mean when we talk about advocacy, and to illustrate some of the regional intimacies that I've been encountering in my research. So let's start with the curator, whose handwriting we see here. And she took a role in putting this label on the envelope of advocating not only for the records but for the authors of the letters. So Sam, who was the curator of the exhibition, she's a historian by trade and training. She is a Wagga local. She doesn't identify as LGBTI or Q, her words, she likes to sing them too. And she hadn't worked with LGBT communities before and was, even though she'd been a local forever, was largely unaware of the history of these communities in Wagga Wagga. And this is a different position to many people who are curating queer and working with queer material, because they're often working from an insider perspective. Sam had acquired the box of letters from the donor, who now lives in a major capital city, and she had drawn on material in the box to illustrate some of the major themes of the exhibition. So the support group ran for these, I think, about 5 years in the 90s. It was led by a staff member at the university, Charles Sturt University, and the community, members of the community. So there was a relationship with the university that was a bit tense, and I'm looking at trying to get into the old student newspaper records, because there's a time when the ads change from being for the support group to the Christian group on campus, and it's quite significant. So she got the box from the donor, and she read these letters herself. So she sat there and read every single letter, and she was shocked by some of the detail in them about the author's sex lives, their emotional state, and their restrictions at times on their desire. So in the early 90s, these people from the region, mostly men, wrote letters to the support group asking for help. And the few I've seen really are quite detailed and are quite really revealing about what the time was like and about issues with identity in the region. One of the ones that I find sticks out in my mind is about an international student who was living on campus and his relationship with the support group and how he could understand it. So Sam was shocked by it. She decided to seal the envelope and put the embargo on it because I think motivated by this concern for what was in it, but possibly, and she hasn't really talked much about it, but by her own protection of people who might be reading it. And so the readers. So there's a few issues here I wanted to discuss. As a curator, Sam's practice and her training is to share information and to educate. And by her embargoing the letters, she created an interference in the archival process. You could argue that's a little bit queer and disruptive, but, you know. And usually that embargoing is done as an archival process in conjunction with the donor, but that process didn't happen here. So in a sense, Sam may have thought of herself as a donor, I'm not sure, and that she had the right to do this. And I think it's an interesting reflection when we look at acquisition and appraisal processes, especially in these times of convergence and GLAM institutions. So that's just an aside. This just lit up at me saying it's got a flat battery. I hope that's okay. We'll see. So the donor on the other... Yeah. The donor, on the other hand, played a passive or caretaker and ambassadorial role for the letters, so he cared for them. He was that softly. They were sent in the mid-90s to the support group, as I explained, and he's kept them in fairly good condition in a box in his house and carried them with him as he moved for the last 20 years. And then he just casually handed them over to the museum when a relationship of trust was developed through contacts who were still in Wagga. Once the letters made it to the archives, however, so once the museum said, no, we don't want them, archives, would you like them? The more formal proceedings and agreements were exchanged, and it was the donor who, when they contacted him, advised the archive staff to just open the envelope because he didn't put anything in one. He didn't know what it was either. So that helped start to solve the mystery. His knowledge of and relationship with the box and the letters meant that he didn't feel a need to embargo them or to protect what was in them. His was a different type of advocacy, one that was motivated to preserve them, but without any particular agenda to silence what was in them. And finally, just briefly, the third advocate is an ambassador for the letters is the archivist. And there are a few archivists, but I'm putting them under one title here, who in their description practices have put a current restricted access statement on the item level record for the letters. So they've removed this embargo, although I think they've left that sticker on it, but they've described it at item level. The whole box has been described, and it's been, this particular envelope or folder has restricted access. As they start to explore options for what to do with the letters. So they're investigating things like attempting to contact each letter writer, which will draw on those intimacies and regional connections to seek permissions, and also we're working together to research the challenge. And so, like much archival work, I think you'll agree, this is an extended project that's setting its own pace. And it's very slow, and quite lovely. So I want to finish today with a reflection on the intimacies of regional living. I know that these intimacies are also present in larger cities and are as productive and confusing as they are in the regions. But in the regional settings, the intimacies are ever present, and there is a distinct absence of choice at times. The two institutions I've talked about here, the regional archives and the museum, have well established working relationships, but I argue it's the regional intimacies of the staff's everyday life, so schooling, shopping, a daily newspaper that's desperate for headline news stories, sports events and the like, that create advocates and ambassadors for the region's people and histories. These roles are juxtaposed with professional practice, and in this setting, I argue that these practices converge, at times perhaps to the detriment of the record. I don't know what would have happened if that embargo had just stayed there for 30 years instead of it being investigated. The extension, so at a more practical level, this research I'm doing is extending into working with the museum and the archives to develop a set of draft protocols for working with LGBT materials, which starts at a point that asks what makes it an object queer, or what is a queer object. And we're working on that over the next year or so, and we're going to test them with small collecting museums, mostly in the region, so volunteer staff thinking about language differently. And so, thank you. That's the story of the collection. Just all of this material was gathered in the consultation sessions that the curator ran. So they were all things that had been living in people's homes, and they'd pulled them out to come to the pub one night and share them with her, and they were handed. So that intimacy, even, I think, is something really interesting to reflect on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Questions?
Yeah, we have a bit of time for questions. So please, if you have anything, just raise your hand.
Thanks. Guy Tranter from ABC. Really more by way of a comment, but you were saying this particular support group was in the first half of the 90s.
Yep.
And I suppose that's a very interesting period in that, you know, social attitudes to the LGBT community were sort of changing slightly. I think it was 1994 that the ABC first broadcast the Mardi Gras, and there was, you know, huge...
Yep.
But at the same time, it was about the last period of history, as far as we know, when people actually wrote letters about everything, you know, that basically then the internet appeared and everything changed. So it's almost a sort of interesting snapshot of communications just at that particular era that people would still write letters about this.
Definitely, and that's why I'm also interested in the student newspaper issues, because that was a time pre-VSU when the student newspapers were well funded and those discussions were happening. So yeah, I think I agree that it's a very interesting time. It was a bit slower maybe in the regions, but maybe I could look into that.
Thanks. Oh, sorry, Julie.
Hello, Julia Mant. Hi,
Hello,
Jessie.
Julia.
Thanks for that. I just was reflecting as you were talking about that interesting space outside of in the non-government archives, where access is always, you know, it's really, it doesn't have the access directions of a government archive. And so it's always a negotiated space.
Yeah.
And having worked with those sort of records, and also engaging where institutions, like say a library, might take personal archives and might handle it very differently from an access point of view than the donor wants, or then the people, the subjects of the thing. So, for instance, there are issues at the moment I've got with one place where they won't close records, which I think should never have come there, which it's to do with where I work at NIDA, versus other times where we've had donations of personal archives and the donor has said, oh, it's fine, just open it to everyone, it doesn't matter. And it's clearly not fine and they don't know. And so you have to override the donor's requirements. They're not the only people who can say about something. So sometimes privacy intersects. It has. Barbara's shaking her head at me. Well, in this case, it was at the University of Sydney, so I suppose there's an argument that some of those records were university records that were caught up within personal archives, is a series that I'm thinking about. But the point is really that it's often just a negotiated space, and I guess as archivists we do manage access in a way that perhaps other individuals don't understand and other institutions don't always do.
And so in a way we need to advocate for those new different ways of thinking about access as well to the other institutions, maybe.
Yeah. Well, and then perhaps that thing about who gets to manage that access for periods of time is interesting to consider.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thanks. I just thought I'd raise the issue. It's a fabulous issue to raise, and I've hit it actually with a collecting archive that imposed their view on what an access condition should be, and I had real problems with it because it was an advocacy and it was about the person. It was so much about what that person's view of the world was. For somebody who was not that person to impose their own personal view, because sometimes it gets down to morals or personal beliefs, and I just think we need to think really carefully about this. I think the way to do it is to go back to the donor and negotiate it. Well, sometimes that's not appropriate, sometimes you can't. Sometimes maybe we should in fact take a leaf from the book of what we do with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There is information in here that may offend some people. Please be aware that there is sensitive material. I think there are some other ways around treating this stuff that we need to be a little bit open to, because I don't think my view is any more legitimate than someone else's view. So that's why I was shaking my head.
And I wouldn't disagree with that. And I do agree it's a negotiation, as we spoke this morning, rather than, it's not one person. The ones that I mentioned, I was just thinking about, there were lecturer records with student records combined. So it's obviously about the student record part that was a concern, because those are subject to an access direction. However, it is certainly true that in many cases you should negotiate around it, and the archivist doesn't have the right to say over anybody else.
I think, can I just respond to that too? I think what you've raised there, Barbara, is the active role that the archivist plays, and that sometimes by doing something you are silencing other things or projecting assumptions, and that's a really important reflection to take away. Yeah.
Hi. Coming from the government archive perspective, we have the Royal Commission into Homosexuality records, which normally would be released under a 30-year rule from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. When it was time for that particular Royal Commission to be opened, we reviewed the records, and a lot of the submissions had been made in camera, so they were private submissions. We didn't feel that we could override that in-camera submission because there were people who were active in the public community who did not identify. So by revealing their identity through our descriptive practices, we would be outing them. So sometimes it's not about, you talked about how you thought that there had been some protection because of the content and the material, so she was in fact protecting the reader. Yeah. But sometimes you have to protect the subject as well.
I think she was also protecting the subject. I suspect she may have seen names she knew in there.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes quite difficult, because how do we negotiate with these people? They've had private conversations. Sometimes they were forced to give evidence because there had been some case and there was a charge, but there was a charge laid against them, but it didn't actually go to court, so it didn't become a public record. Those were all things that we had to look at when we looked at the records. So they're currently sitting there and they're restricted for further 75 years.
So, there's a question down the front. Yep, down the front.
Hi, Susan Kennedy, City of Sydney Archives. I don't even know how to ask this question because I suppose I'm thinking if I think you said something like you were that you got some material from sharing at a night at the pub.
Yeah, she did.
Yeah, I think in a regional context, I was wondering how does the professional archivist manage the level of trust that is required to relinquish that donation to a professional? You know, I guess what are your donation conditions, or is that something that becomes a case-by-case basis?
So this is a challenge to the converged model because it was a museum curator who ran the pub night and she was using it as a theoretically informed consultation process. So the museum sector is saying, do this. This is the best way to tell stories and learn and share. And so then the tension came as the handover happened between the museum from the museum to the archive, when the archives staff went, oh, but where's the donation agreement, or where's the transfer agreement? Who owns this? And I think that's a really interesting space to be negotiating, and we need to try and understand. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. Yep, great.
Well, by way of a quick comment, as a consumer of archival records, there's a set of, from World War II, Australian Army, 18 life histories of camp men that were collected. And when we discovered this, we asked for access and we got a heavily expurgated, cut back version. And so we kind of asked them to review it, and they did, and it came back with less excisions. And then we asked them again, and it came back with fewer again, to the point where it became clear that in the first version, the entire first paragraph was blacked out. The second time round, we discovered that it was their kind of introductory history. My father was a plumber, blah, blah, blah. And even in the third version, there are things where what's expunged is you've got, and I said to him, do you want to? And then there's a blank. I assume the word we're looking for is fuck. But that as a consumer, what you do is just keep going back, I think. Yeah. Force people to kind of review it and hope you get a more liberal reviewer as you go.
Yeah. So I'm interested in that, in the State Library of New South Wales has put all of Gary Wotherspoon's oral histories up with no seemingly sense of permissions or redactions or anything of those stories, and so it's a complete opposite to what you're talking about, where they're just saying, here it all is, and we'll take it down if you want us to. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Please thank Dr. Jessie Lymn. The next slide show. Yep. Okay, so the next paper that we have is Susan Long and Matthew Davies, who are both archivists, and Matthew works at the Living History of the West, and they're going to be talking about the archival reflex. Please make them welcome.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realise it wasn't at the beginning.
That's it.
Cool.
I'm so comfortable.
Oh, it's nice there, right? The Archival Reflex is a project that Susan and I have been working on for the last 6 months or so.
Yeah.
And it's fundamentally an exhibition that we're going to be staging at the Living Museum of the West in Melbourne in November of this year.
Yeah, late November. Yeah.
And I guess it kind of stems from a conversation that we both sort of had about these ideas of Hal Foster's about the archival impulse, and this idea of artists who both use and create archives. So for the exhibition, we've chosen 4 artists from Melbourne who, I guess, in our view, sort of work in that way, who both source materials from archives and create archives in their practices. So the presentation we're going to give you today, we're basically going to cover off 3 aspects of this project. So firstly, Susan will give a bit of a background on the sort of theoretical underpinnings and the idea of artists working with archives. I'll talk about the Living Museum as a kind of site and a context for the exhibition, and then we'll give a sort of quick overview of the artists involved in the show.
And because we're collaborating, we thought we could talk over each other at times as well, so see how we go.
Yeah.
I'll put my specs on. And here comes the technology. So really, this is the background to, as Matthew was saying, to some of the sort of practice and theory behind the idea of the exhibition. And actually, several speakers have already touched upon these points. So I hope I'm not sort of telling grandma how to suck eggs, but I just thought just give some background. So the archive is changing and has changed. Boundaries have shifted, and the archive has become part of the everyday vernacular, surrounding the ordering, classifying and sorting of personal collections. So archive has now become a verb, and we all do it. And it's akin to a reflex, hence the title. Thanks to primarily to the internet and our mobile phones. So the archive that exists in the public and private environments of the 21st century is driven by a knowledge economy, expanding information production and a ballooning material consumption. The public or institutional archive offers a practical solution to the burden of collecting, although, as we heard an earlier speaker say, even the institutions are running out of space, as collections become too prolific to move from place to place and too valuable to throw away. So the archive has entered the zones of uncertainty and is seen to be in flux. Since the late 1980s, cultural theorists have commented on the archive. Derrida, sorry, I'm a bit nervous. Derrida saying the archive being a place of repressions and suppressions, and Foucault offering a theoretical basis for rethinking both history and the archive, perceiving the archive to be productive, not reproductive. Enter the artists and the archivists, one primarily concerned with classification and taxonomies, and the other bound by no conventional practices when it comes to inhabiting the archive. Nevertheless, contemporary art practice and institutional archives have influenced each other. The archivist is still engaged with the continuum of records creation, and the artist concerned with addressing the visual renditions of absence and obscure narratives. But an archival turn has led archivists to question and assess the performative effect their professional practice enacts on the archive, how their work processes may affect the production of archives, promote the circulation of ideas and cultural interventions, as well as considering the role that social and cultural forces play in the preceding stages of archiving. So no archive is fixed nor unbiased, and archival artists are also concerned with these factors. In the field of current art practice, there are explicit connections between the artistic process, research and theory. The art practitioner works at the intersection of art, media and archives. Delving into the archive as a form of creative investigation is common practice for present-day artists. And such an impulse to delve into the archive, to visually restore loss and to rebroadcast marginal voices is still an observable fact, first described by the art historian Hal Foster in his 2004 essay, The Archival Impulse, defining archival art as that which makes historical information, often lost or displaced, physically present. To this end, artists elaborate on the found image, object and text and favour the installation format, which we'll talk about later. The performance of both archivist and artist refracts the archive through their interpretation of the material, and each entity is then reflected in the archive as the interpretation becomes another record. This is the logic of the archive, the trace, the residue and the remnant, a space of insinuation where archival art jostles between fictiveness and fact, and sometimes to notable effect. In the archive, interpretations are invited and not preconceived, and hence the idea of the archive continues to be a compelling influence and edifice in present-day exhibitions. The allure of the archive could be due to several factors. It can be as simple as nostalgia for the past, or the drive to create histories based on cultural objects in the archive. Or, as icons suggest, be a direct response to the neoliberalism of the 21st century and its withdrawal of our sense of agency, which several speakers have already commented upon today. A society driven by such forces as individuation, consumerism and profit at all cost has greatly diminished the power of collective memory. It is in the archive that social agency can find expression and the present can be informed by the past. Things were not always as they are. Instead of seeing the archive as purely a space of preservation, artists and archivists are employing the archive as a device to validate diverse types of cultural production and knowledge. And once, where the archivist was mere custodian or keeper, at the receiving end, reliant upon what the administration had created and passed on, they are now perceived to be a central cultural agent engaging in situating information, rendering, in a way, the invisible visible. The archivist has now emerged as curator, facilitator and collaborator. Conceptually, something that could have, might have been and never was lends itself to the notion of the archive as a point of departure, as opposed to a point of termination for artists, curators and researchers. There are those creatives who are interested in the knowledge politics of the archive and address concerns around archival accessibility, suppression, racialisation, gendering and commercialisation of information, whilst others are interested in the more general idea of cultural knowledge and circulation. Artists can pose questions that have no answers, reimagine the archive, fashion previously unseen visual narratives, revealing earlier unknown, unidentified connections, enabling a multiplicity of access points and new experiences for the viewer and auditor. Such activities denaturalise the presumptive boundaries of the official archive space. Many contemporary artists produce works in which documentary practices and materials are used in highly unorthodox ways. As archivists, we may experience some anxiety surrounding the shifting boundaries of the archive. However, rather than perceiving ourselves as purely being overseers, we can now see ourselves as advisors, guides and curators, enabling access to material as well as facilitating discussions around provenance and proprietary in regard to original records, collections and their creators. Hence, the archive and its methods for archivists and artists is a generated site of construction and deconstruction, a place of speculation and fluidity, where archives of the people, by the people, may well reside.
So this notion of archives by the people and for the people, I guess has some sort of echo in the sort of operational philosophies of the Living Museum of the West. I guess the mission statement of the museum described itself as actively involving the people of Melbourne's West and others in documenting, preserving and interpreting the richness and depth of the region's social, industrial and environmental history. So integral to this conception of the museum is an understanding of the museum's interaction and integration within the context of Melbourne's western regions, where the total community, its environment and heritage are also considered part of the museum. So the museum itself was founded in 1984. On that previous slide, you can see the launch, which was on top of the Westgate Bridge there by the then Arts Minister, Race Matthews. And it was founded in 1984 by a local historian, Olwen Ford, the then future Premier of Victoria, Joan Kerner, and 2 local historians, Eva and David Yenkin. And the conceptual underpinnings of the museum's operational philosophy were influenced by, I guess, 2 main streams of research methodologies and museum theory that were developed in Europe through the 60s and 70s. The first of these is Swedish author Sven Lindqvist's, I guess, theory of digging where you stand and the associated movement that followed from that. And it's in a nutshell, this comes from, I guess, Lindqvist's own historical research into the history of industry, and his realization that this history is sort of largely concentrated on the views and recollections of I guess, owners and managers of industry, so, and offered little reference to the views and recollections of workers. So Lindqvist reasoned that workers could offer new perspectives on their workplaces, that they know their trade, and that in that field that they're experts. And in that workplace they can meet with professional historians and other researchers and offer insights on more or less an equal footing. More broadly, I guess, and amid a culture of sort of DIY and broader participation in music, art and theatre, and sort of acknowledging that in order to equip workers as historians, they would need access to some of the techniques techniques and methods of historical research. Lindqvist wrote a manual that essentially offered instructions on how to access sources of information for historical research, and how these sources can sort of assist research and allow people to document their own histories. So such a methodology sort of left aside a lot of the sort of traditional sort of means and methods by, I guess, sort of academics and commercial-based historical research, and instead sort of favoured sort of participatory exhibitions and other cultural events that encouraged the exchange of knowledge and provided sort of fora for debate and for new experiences. And these exhibitions were concerned not just with visual arts, but also broader demonstrations relating to sort of science and technology, to public affairs, to local cultural and social historical projects as well. So sharing a few of the concerns of this sort of dig where you stand movement, the second stream that influenced the Living Museum's philosophy is development of a stream of museumology called the Echo Museum. And while it's difficult to offer a sort of precise definition of the Echo Museum, it's I guess it can be thought of as either a museum in or relating to a particular community or relating to a particular environment. We see here the first location of the Living Museum of the West in Footscray in 1984. And so I guess the development of the Echo Museum as a philosophy sort of took place within a broader movement of criticism and reform aimed at museums in general, mostly through the 60s and 70s. And these reforms sort of aimed at incorporating new developments in the social and human sciences, revitalising techniques of display, exhibition and communication, and ultimately altering the traditional relationship between the institution and the public. And central to this orientation, or to the development of the Echo Museum was its orientation towards community, both in relation to the geographical scope and its emphasis on the participation of local residents, aiming to move members of the public from being consumers of the museum to actors or even authors within the museum. So for the Living Museum, the most basic objective then is to research and present the history of the region while involving the people of the region in that research. The first director of the museum, Alden Ford, who we mentioned previously, conceptualises the museum as being a kind of story in itself, It's the story of the Western region, but it's contained within that story is a kind of, I guess, agency that involves the search to discover the story of the people of the region. And it considers the people of the region as the main resource, as well as the region itself as being an equally important resource. So accordingly, the archives and other holdings of the museum have little to do with the classical models of the museums, where I guess museums exhibits serve to promote a kind of idealised sort of representation of particular civilisations. A living museum sort of directs attention not towards objects in their display, but towards people and their stories and studies of the local environment. And it does this mostly via its collections of oral histories and photography, which sort of aim to capture the memories, perceptions and accounts of people and their experience of the regions in their own words and in their own ways. And we see a slide here of what is now the visitor centre at the Living Museum. That's from about 1985, I believe. But in terms of its relationship to its surroundings, again, Alvin Ford writes of the museum of having something of like a sort of a literal application of Malraux's notion of the museum of the museum without walls, and that it's a sort of, I guess, a sort of symbiotic relationship between the museum and its surroundings. Ford had her own sort of quite poetic way of putting this, in, where she suggested that the museum is the region and the region is the museum, where the potential of the museum project is revealed, and in that it considers a view of heritage that's, I guess, sort of both broad and microscopic. It's one where it's sort of, I guess, interested in everything that goes on in the region, and one where the relations of people to the region and the environment are seen in the context of time and space that sort of ripples outward towards a broader national context, and even flowing out into a broader sort of international historical context as well. And so, I guess, primarily this question of context too is intimately linked to the sort of artistic and cultural programs that the museum's been involved with over the years. We've had a long history of facilitating initiatives, I guess, across music and theatre, to film screenings, and also to visual art. And so the Archival Reflex project that Susan and I are working on continues this tradition. And so the show that we're doing is actually situated within the archive itself. And doing this, we've invited a number of artists to make work, to use materials from the archive, to respond to the archive and to the site, and I guess to consider the broader contexts to which their work will relate. Yeah. And so we'll just give you a quick oversight of some of the artists that we've got involved in this show.
And now that I'm over my nerves, I'd just like to say that Matthew and I actually met with the artists at the Museum of the West, and it was an invitation, and we, in a way, we were there, they asked us questions, we roamed around the space outside, so it's an interior space and an exterior space, and has this enormous potential. And the artists were really, really excited, and they could touch things, and we were there to guide them and also to answer their questions, as I said. But it's been a really engaging process. And I work in a state institution, and so I found it just so, as an archivist, I just found it so liberating. And then as an artist too, I found I could cross these sort of, this intersection where, archivists are engaged in a form of creativity as well. And not just in creating records, but it's about memories and engaging with the people who also create the records in the archives. And then I was so struck by the potential of the Living Museum of the West, because it has quite a strong, it has a physical presence, but it does not have the organisation or the themed type of organisation that your typical museum would have. Okay, so Zoe Alley and Christos Tolkas are two of the 20. I'll be 5 minutes. Two of the artists that we have asked to exhibit, and Zoe and Christos are long-time collaborators. Zoe is a photographer, and you may know that Christos Tolkas is a writer. They produce work that dynamically observes the cultural fabric of private and public spaces of the city, and their work coexists as text and image, interweaving between inhabited and imagined spaces. So in A New Jerusalem 2011, the previous slide and this one, they explored expressions of worship and cultural diversity, commenting on the experiences of exile, faith and identity through image and text. For the Living Museum of the West, Tolkas and Ali will show new work developed from the archive. So they're reinforcing the interchange between the archive and its making, and the artists have retrieved a photographic group portrait of factory workers that frames untold stories and sings with unheard voices. Everything that is not photographed is not lost. The third artist we've invited to the show and who has agreed to participate is Julie Davies. Julie Davies is a Melbourne artist, and her art practice embraces the collaborative production of objects and photographs that frequently engage in the documentation of the overlooked and the discarded, as seen here in her study of the insignificant in 2006. Since Davies dismantled 2006 and 2012, where she videoed 12 artists de-installing their exhibitions, she's become interested in recording the objects, text and cultural debris that necessitate archiving and conservation to avert them from potentially disappearing from the public memory. Davies proposes to collaborate with several key staff at the Living Museum, one of them being Matthew, of the West, inviting them to select items in the museum holdings that they value historically, aesthetically or otherwise, which she will then re-photograph and reorganise and bring to light an alternative archive within the museum's pre-existing compendia. Thank you, Matthew.
Our next artist is another Melbourne-based artist, Andrew Hayeswinkle. Andrew works across photography, video, sculpture and installation. His work's embedded in sort of archival and museological theory and practice, often examining the sort of custodial role of institutions in tandem with considerations of the materiality and changing representation of collections and objects over time. These works we see here were from a show at the Centre for Contemporary Photography here in Melbourne from 2015, and I've developed in a residency. Sorry, I don't have the details of the residency, but the works are plaster casts from replicas of a Donatello, I believe. Yes. And so Andrew's taken the plaster casts and shaped them with his hand and made casts of casts, and reconstructed the facial structures. The next artist we have is Egyptian-born Australian artist Raf Ishaq. Raf works across painting, video and sculpture, and also site-specific interventions. His work draws variously on politics, architecture and the graphic nature of written language. And also from his own heritage as an Egyptian-born man. So his work sort of slides between sort of abstraction and nuanced representation. This work here is, it comes from a series where he made a series of requests to immigrate to countries around the world, or to every country at that point in time around the world, and these works are sourced from the responses from those various governments. For the work at the Living Museum, Rafat has engaged with the military-industrial history of the Western regions, considering the munitions factories and also Australia's continual role in global conflicts and his own experience of militarisation in his native Egypt as a child. And I think that, there we go, another one of Rafat's work gives an indication of the scale of the work as well. And that's about it. We've got a few references, and there, whoops.
Oh. And that's the show.
That's the details of the show at the Living Museum, if you'd like to attend.
Yeah, we invite everybody.
Very thought-provoking and interesting project that you have on. We do have time for maybe one or two questions, if anyone has any.
What happens to the works once they've been produced, and how do you archive the interpretations of become part of it?
That's an unknown as yet.
Yeah, there's some works that will be produced that will be incorporated into the archive.
Yeah.
Other works won't. Yeah.
So it's actually still in process. That's the really exciting thing about this, is that we're there as it's being created, and we have the conversations with the creators or the creatives, and so it has this air about it which is sort of an unknown, but at the same time we know things are being made, and also the artists coming in and being in the environment. And one of the artists, Andrew Haysmichael, his creative work, he's been in the States and he's been working in an archive, and that is some of the work that's coming into the Living Museum of the West. So we're having this conversation. Forget about the people, the archives are talking to each other. So, yeah, it's quite exciting, yeah.
Thanks for that. We'll move on to the final paper for the session. Thanks to Speaker Susan and Matthew again. On to the next thing. And our final paper for the session is Nicole Gammie, answering the question that I'm sure you all want to know the answer to, which is, what do Beryl, Ingold, Rural Youth and the Agricultural Bureau have in common? So please thank Nicole for coming.
Thank you. So hopefully by the end we'll have an answer to that question. But to start with, I'd like to provide a bit of my background. It's a little bit different. Unlike a few others that have mentioned this morning, I've come in from a completely different background. I want to talk a bit about the collections that I had a chance to go through and what I found out. So, and some acknowledgements. So to set the scene, my background, graduated nearly 20 years ago out of the environmental field. So my background is actually in environmental science, and I spent nearly 20 years playing on salt sites, getting sunburnt, making mud pies. So this is a little bit different to, I guess, what I started out in terms of my professional life. So a lot of property, so a lot of salt sites, so a lot of re-veg projects, all that sort of stuff. Diagnosing problems, trying to work things out from that side of the coin. Met a lot of landholders, heard a lot of interesting stories. A lot of them the same, I have to say, after a while. I started my studies just over 2 years ago at Charles Sturt Uni doing a Masters in Information Studies. They also offer a scholarship to undertake 280 hours of work at the Regional Archive, which Jessie mentioned earlier. I was a little bit different. Unlike a lot of some of the other scholars, I didn't actually live in Wagga at the time when I did the scholarship. I was actually commuting 4 hours each way. So the decision was made and suggested to me that instead of focusing on one larger project, that I might have a look at a whole lot of smaller collections that the archive had that had and hadn't been processed. So during this time I developed a very bad paper habit and got through about 11 collections in that 280 hours. Give me a box, let me go, I'll see what I can find. It was really good, very interesting. So it's covered a range of topics, of which I will talk about 3 of them today. Basically, in that time, I processed 155 ordinary boxes, 5 oversized, 4 photo albums, put back about 75 boxes, 11 photo albums, 1 oversized box, and a quarter of a map drawer, which all came out of the boxes to start with. I added about 1,700 items to the database and shredded a little bit of paper in that process. These were a mix of both state-based and state-required archives to be kept. I played with some of the university archives and a lot of the actual regional archives. And the three I'm talking about are more regional, collections of regional interest rather than anything else. And I covered a diverse range of topics. So as I said, the three I'll talk about are interrelated. And luckily for me, they focused on my area of strong point, which I think is something that in the past had sort of been left behind. A lot of the pastoral ones have been done, but not so much the pure agricultural or environmental ones. So the Agricultural Bureau. Interesting lot. These operated in New South Wales between 1910 and 2002. The primary aim of the actual Bureau was to extend information and training opportunities to rural areas with a particular focus on agriculture and related topics within the home. They were very much a production focused groups as opposed to land care that tends to look at environmental issues. They weren't so much interested, given the era, necessarily about totally environmental issues. The New South Wales Department of Agriculture, which has had several name changes since and before, assisted in providing the groups with technical abilities to deliver field days and continued this throughout the period of time. During the 1930s, they actually started with an annual conference, and a lot of the conference proceedings, among other things, are caught up in the collection. And it was very interesting because this was the second collection I went through, and there were very few photographs in this collection in the original one, which I did comment to the lady I was sitting next to, and I said to June, I said, very interesting, not much here. I'll hold that thought and get back to you about it later. Part of this one, was partway through it, and the archivist came to me and said, think there might be some stuff in here that you might be interested relating to these guys. Can you have a look through this list and let me know if you want anything? Had a look through the list and said, yes, please. Which happened to be Beryl Ingold's collection. As a result of basically pulling hers apart, then the suggestion was, well, how about we actually tidy up what remains? So I pulled all the Ag Bureau stuff out. A lot of that was duplicates. A lot of it was actually the conference proceedings, and then ended up dealing with what remained in Beryl's collection. Interestingly enough, Beryl was the first woman president for the Ag Bureau during the 1970s, which was an interesting time. And she's also the link between the three collections. Beryl was also a patron for rural youth, which was interesting enough. In her collection, she had the papers from the conference when she was president. She actually recorded her speeches that way. But there's actually no record within her papers of her involvement with rural youth. I only found that out when I played in that collection. So I managed to get the two collections down into some sort of ordinance. And what was really interesting about Beryl was that she was involved with a lot of different things within the community. From CWA, so the Country Women's Association, through to looking at education. It was part of her passion, and also the agricultural world as well. So after that, thought, well, after seeing various references to rural youth within the Ag Bureau collection, made the suggestion to the archivist, may as well do this one and just see what happens. Thought, keep going with the continuity, because these guys were also managed by the same group within New South Wales Agriculture for a number of times. This was by far the biggest collection of the three. These actually had 50 boxes to start with. So it was a far bigger endeavour than the previous two, which probably had about 15 in total. That two were really easy to get rid of. They were grain samples. So as part of this, what they had actually is a series of grain samples. So they had sort of some canola, some wheat, which they used to use to test people with. Say, well, hand you this, what is it? Without a label on it. So that's very interesting. So just to give you a bit of background about rural youth, just for those, because you look at it and think, so what did they actually do? Rural youth is similar to guides and scouts, just to give you a bit of a feel. But they focus, as well as having some interesting projects like you can do with guides and scouts, these guys have a bit of a focus on rural activities. So you can actually get an award for training a sheepdog, or you can get an award for raising a steer. Not something you necessarily do with guides or scouts. So the two grain sample boxes had a one-way ticket out from upstairs where the collection was kept, out the back door. They weren't put back upstairs because I saw them as a risk, as an ongoing food source for any unwanted little souls that might want to live upstairs in the archive. So that was an interesting thing. I had to call it the collection that keeps on giving. I brought this collection down. The trolley takes 12 boxes every time you bring it down. So I said, well, let's get them all down. I can have a bit of a look and see what was in there. Got the first lot down, opened the boxes up, got part way through and went, yikes, here we go, here's some more Ag Bureau stuff. Okay, luckily it was all conference stuff. Checked it out, got rid of all of it. Phew, because I'd already stacked it all up and it was all packed up, ready to go back upstairs. Yikes. So the second lot that came down were a whole lot of what they lovingly called dump files. I spent quite a lot of time going through the dog's breakfast in those. And then the last lot of boxes that came down, I found there was a whole lot of odd things. Photographs, tapes, a whole lot of reels and a whole lot of slides actually of bits and pieces. The photographs, when I went through those, unfortunately a lot of them weren't labelled, but that's where a lot of my Ag Bureau photos came from. And how I picked a lot of those out was actually the logo of the Ag Bureau on them. Because I'm managed by the same crew, the idea of filing was interesting to say the least, and so I did separate them out where I could. But a lot of them have been left in the Rural Youth collection because I couldn't identify where they came from. But Rural Youth really didn't put together field days with blokes out of the 1950s with the old utes and all that sort of stuff in the paddock, but had no evidence to sort of put them anywhere else. There was also a large number of duplicates with this collection. So in the long run, while I might have brought 50 boxes down from upstairs, I only put 15 back. There was an amazing amount of duplication in this. One of the most interesting, there's a couple of interesting elements out of this one. The first one is they had nearly a complete set of award booklets. So if you ever wanted to know what Rural Youth did, if you wanted to go for an embroidery award, you could have a look through and see what they expected at the various different levels of that. And the other thing, one of the other ones they had too was a lot of the conferences and that sort of thing. They actually had some of those taped, so we actually spent some time transferring those taped onto a digital format so we could actually save them, because they were all on the old cassettes at that stage. So that was an interesting. Then I got the gorgeous job of going back through them and working out who was speaking and when it was for and all this sort of stuff, because a lot of the labelling on the containers was not particularly terrific. But the interesting thing for both the Ag Bureau and the Rural Youth was that towards the end of the files, I saw notification that there was some reshuffling. The groups had declined over many years, like a lot of things have happened not just in rural areas, but also in the city. And the question was, so what happened to these groups? A consultant was employed to ask the question about long-term viability to both groups. And the really, frustrating thing from my end was that neither report is present in either of the collections. So I knew what happened to the Ag Bureau. There was a series of meetings after that and they're documented, and basically the groups that were left, and there was about half a dozen of those from what I recall, were asked to either incorporate themselves and stand alone, or they had to close and hand any money over to a similar group. Rural Youth was a slightly different kettle of fish. There was no minutes following that particular time, and so it was a bit of a hunt and search mission to find out. A bit of Facebook searching and a 3/4 an hour later phone call indicated to me that the same thing happened to them. They were basically forced to incorporate and close, and basically there's 3 groups that still persist in New South Wales today. Ironically, 2 are on the north coast, just south of the Queensland border, and the other one is just north of the Victorian border at Bega. So, and they're starting to get back some of the activities that they used to do. These guys were involved with, if you've ever been to the Royal Easter Show, there's often show camp with a lot of the kids, high school age kids. They used to run a lot of that sort of stuff. And so the kids would come in from the rural areas, show cattle, be involved with the pavilion work and look after things. And they're trying to reinstate that now with the new group. And they're hoping to get some more groups up and going. So it hasn't quite died, but it's unfortunately, certainly was on its way out. So in terms of findings, yes. For all the collections that I went through, not just these three but the others as well, I found that there were gaps, some of the ones I've just mentioned. Some of these gaps made the decisions interesting in creating a context, such as how long the organisation existed for or what happened to this grant. I had some other places where I had funding applications. Also, some only provided a very limited story of the bigger picture, such as I mentioned earlier, the various committees that Beryl was involved in. It was interesting because Beryl herself donated the material, and what contained in it seemed to be only what hadn't been disposed of over the years. And then a decision was potentially made to donate them to the archives at a later period in time. Also, as part of the work, I wrote a series of agency histories for all but the university archives that I worked on. And it was interesting in terms of trying to create that agency history about not being able to tell the whole story because I couldn't find out some of the information or wasn't sure of things. It was also interesting having to make decisions about what to keep. Some things were pretty obvious. The duplicates made it very easy. They went very quickly to the left and on to being destroyed. But other things took a little bit more time, and also had some challenges like dealing with those lovely old gorgeous sticky photo albums. My new bestest friend was actually some dental floss. Works really well actually. It's terrific from that angle. So in developing agency histories, I also found that the internet helped a fair bit, and also found during some of that time too, other archives hold some of the other information, such as with the rural youth. There's also quite a, not a lot, and I actually had a chance to have a look at some of their stuff. It's actually held by State Archives at Kingswood. So there's some stuff prior to the relocation of the archive over to Cowra. It was actually left at Kingswood. Had a lot of different formats. Hopefully with what I've done in terms of creating the catalogue and also the agency history, that there's been some value adding to what was there, because a lot of it in the past wasn't actually available for research, and the decision making was always interesting. And trying to describe things, how do you describe this, put it into words that someone else might understand. They're my two boxes of grain samples down there on the left, just before they, were removed. Prior to the scholarship, rural youth and ag bureau collections were largely unprocessed and therefore unavailable to the public and researchers looking into what social infrastructure existed in the past in rural New South Wales. Combining Beryl's two collections makes it easy to access with now similar topics grouped together, because with her two collections it was almost there was a bit in both for some topics. Without these collections, researchers or writers would not have a view into their existence, how they operated, all the issues faced, nor as a primary source of research information. These records are important to keep as they provide documents to assist in looking back in an unbiased way to look on history. Memory can be selective and defective without details. That is human nature, and this is supported by research. Without the archives at CSU and others including local libraries, is it likely these items would have been kept or thrown out? And also, who else would be interested? A lot of these organisations don't exist anymore. In the future, it provides an opportunity to look back to the past and see how things happened during this time. It is an indication of how people entertained and educated themselves in rural New South Wales, along with how information was shared among those in the agricultural sphere in the days before social media and other entertainment options. Research supports the retention of such documents, although depending on the criteria used by an archive, it is possible that some of these could be skewed either by not accepting or by what material is actually kept. Also, the scholarship here provided me with the opportunity to develop some skills. As I mentioned before, I didn't come out of a record-keeping environment. Although interesting, looking back, we did actually keep records, certainly with a lot of the funding that I was involved with devolving. But it was interesting that it was kind of dumped in one place, and it was only selected parts of that, in particular the contract ends of things. It was also interesting learning about the past as well. The big thing I found valuable was repetition. Going through 11 collections provided me with at least 11 opportunities to do some of the same things, which by the end of it, I think the archivists had a few less you can't type comments or we need to add more detail to this. So it was really quite valuable from that angle. It gave me a chance, also an insight into see the diverse range of collections that are held by the Regional Archive. Because while you can have a look on the website, some of it, as it hasn't been processed, is not available, so you're not actually aware of what they had. Because ironically, the first collection I actually was handed to process was actually a land care group, which was interesting because I'd just come out of cleaning out one land care group's records, and having worked in that area, it was really quite interesting and straightforward. It was actually the Wagga Urban Land Care Group, and I'd actually been down to Wagga about 15 years beforehand and had a look at their urban salinity work that they'd done, and that's where a lot of the archive collection was on, so it was interesting to see where it actually came from. So I'd like to thank the archive staff at Wagga for the opportunity to spend the 280 hours with them. I think it did take a little convincing given the fact I did have a 4-hour commute each way. So to manage that, I'd spend as much time as I could, and I was often the one that they turned the light out on at night. And I'd go, hey, give me a minute, I just got to grab my stuff, because I'd be the one out the back, still playing with paper, still looking through stuff, still seeing what I could find. I'd also like to thank the conference organisers for giving me the opportunity to share my story this afternoon. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you much, Lee.
Thanks for that. Okay, we have a bit of time for some questions, if anyone has any.
I have a bit of a flippant question. Is there now a Mr. Regional wherever? Those guys sitting there with those lovely girls in their sessions. You said that some of these organisations still exist on the Queensland border and down towards Victoria. I wonder if they've reformed and sessions got forward.
They had different things. It was very interesting. A lot of those photos are out of the early 1980s type thing. They actually had different awards for the. They had Miss Rural Youth, and they did actually eventually do something for the guys as well. But it is interesting to look through the photos to see how things did evolve, and some of the discussions. There were some very heated discussions about some of the statewide competitions that they used to hold. The fashion show was a really widely. It often came up as a challenge for them to judge every year. The debating competition was a bit hot under the collar at times too, evidently, by some of the paperwork I saw as I went through it. Okay. So it was an interesting era. Again, I think it reflects the times, and most of the groups with rural youth were in the rural areas. But interestingly enough, there were a couple in the city, generally associated in Sydney with the agricultural high schools. But they would generally tend to be, and they would range from anyone between 8 and 30 depending on, and then there was often several groups within them. There's a young group under 18s, and then there was a over 18s, largely to manage the alcohol factor more than anything else. So, yes, yeah, they did have there was a few comments one year that show camp was a bit merry, you could say, was probably one way to put it. So, yes, a few of them got a little bit in trouble that year. I thought I was like, okay, well, just interesting, but we'll keep going with that. So, yeah, they were quite widely contested, and it was a privilege to actually get to the state level with any of the competitions within rural youth. It was a pretty strong. They'd have regional-based things, and then they'd go to the state level. So,
I have a question, Nicole. Have you thought about any outreach activities to let people know about the fact that these collections are now processed and listed? And I'm thinking particularly of the Invisible Farmer project that's happening with the Scholarship Research Centre here, where they're looking at the history of women in agriculture, and it sounds like that would be a perfect sort of fit with that. But it's important, isn't it, once you've processed these collections and made them available, to get the word out there too, because they need to be out there further than just the archival catalogue.
Very much so, and they are certainly available on the CSU, on the Archives webpage. One thing I did write for the Archivists was actually a blog post, which did actually come out in early January, after Christmas, I put together some stuff. And in discussing stuff with the Archivists with all the agency histories that were written, there's an opportunity to release them as blog posts as well over time, and that's up to them to make that decision. So I did write something as a starting point to do that, to let people know that some of the stuff was out there and what was around. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, we might finish the session there, bang on time. So I thank the speakers for sticking to their time. And I think one of the things that the whole session has really shown is the really the importance of place, the place that the records are created in the context of those records. I think that really came through strongly in this session. So thanks for that session, and please thank our speakers once again.